Good evening. My name is Phil Schomber. I'm the adult programmer here at Hedberg. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker, Julie Hill. Julie is the horticulture outreach specialist at UW Extension, and she's going to be sharing some tips on how we can best create a bird-friendly garden all year round, no matter the season. So let me turn it over to Julie to get us started.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks for everybody for being here. I appreciate it. I think all of you grabbed handouts at the back, but in case you didn't, there's a few handouts. One is a note sheet for everything we're going to talk about, so you don't have to be furiously writing down notes. There is a planting guide back there, and then there's also an evaluation form that I would love for you to fill out after the program. It's anonymous. You don't have to write your name on it. It's required that we do that to provide some feedback. So without further ado, a little bit more of an introduction. As he said, my name is Julie. I am the Horticulture Outreach Specialist for UW-Madison Division of Extension, and I serve Rock, Walworth, and Jefferson counties. And so a lot of what I do is programming, presentations. I work with master gardeners in the area as well. And we try to do a lot of horticulture education and outreach. So before we get too far into the program, I'm going to pause here. I'm going to share one of my favorite quotes by Maya Angelou. And it says, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." So some of the things that we talk about tonight, maybe you're already doing them, maybe you're not, and that's okay. This is a judgment-free zone. I'm not here to criticize you or judge you if you're doing something that maybe I say you should be doing something else. Okay, so as we learn, we do better, right? And a lot of that with conservation work and a lot of gardening work. Gardening's experimenting all the time, really, right? Things fail, we learn, we do better the next year. So I just want to kind of pause there. It's okay. This is judgment-free. Nobody's criticizing anybody here. So why should we garden with wildlife as a priority? Now, I kind of said birds on that one, and we'll get more into birds later, but kind of generally, any kind of things about why we should garden for wildlife.
So we're taking their habitat.
Okay, so there's less habitat for them. Good. Anything else? Okay, well, I think we all care about having a healthy environment, right? Healthy water, good soil, and preserving it for the future. And you can actually think of your yard, your garden, your patio, your balcony as habitat. Anything can be habitat. So when we think about habitat and conservation, a lot of times we think about these big nature preserves, and that's where conservation happens. That's where preservation happens. And really, we can kind of change that scale of thinking to our backyard, or our front balcony, or a community garden, or our town, our community. Those are, in fact, ecosystems. That's where we have to center our efforts. The majority of land in the U.S. is privately owned, so there's a lot of opportunity there for gardening for habitat, for wildlife as a priority. And there's a real urgency in helping nature. I think we all probably realize that. There's major decreases in biodiversity, in wildlife, natural ecosystems, and that biodiversity doesn't just exist in these big national parks. They exist right here in our communities, in the cities, in our backyards. There's a quote from Owen Boyle that I'll just read off. I think it's on your handout. "No matter where you live and no matter how much land you influence, you can have a positive impact for birds and the insect species that many of them depend on for food." Okay, so I'm going to start with the real bad news. We're seeing losses of biodiversity everywhere, but we're going to talk about birds in this program tonight. And so a recent national study that was published in Science just in 2019, it was actually the first to really draw attention to this and to quantify the numbers and quantify the total decline in bird populations in the US and Canada. And overall bird diversity has declined by almost 30%. And that's pretty huge. And that's in our lifetime, that's 3 billion birds gone, just in our lifetime. Wisconsin is showing those same decreases. They've done some studies through the Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas with the DNR, Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, and other organizations, and they're seeing that same decline, 30%. We're seeing losses in every type of habitat, particularly grassland birds. You can see is over 53%. But every area, shoreland, forest birds, everywhere is seeing declines, every type of habitat. What's kind of interesting, though, is that we are seeing increases in waterfowl, raptors, and turkeys. Why is that?
we've been focusing on conservation for those.
Okay, right. Focusing on conservation, though. So raptors, there's some big programs, right? Environmental Protection Act that protected our bald eagles, protected other raptors. Wetlands conservation efforts are dedicated, like the duck stamp, have paid off with a lot of waterfowl population for sports hunting. Lots of conservation policies for hawks and falcons and other raptors. We'll talk about the banning of DDT that was major for the raptor populations. And then with wild turkey, again, is we have dedicated conservation funding and enterprising efforts because of hunting. And so those efforts have made huge increases in these birds, right? Which is great. Great big, it's great to support these huge conservation policies. But what we're actually seeing is declines in our backyard birds. These are all really common bird species that visit our feeders in our backyards in every kind of urban environment. And we're seeing, a 25, 30% loss in these types of species. So again, big conservation efforts and policies are important. They are great. But in each of us, in our yards and the communities that we have contact with, we can influence them in a positive way. So what are some causes of this of this bird decline? Habitat loss, we kind of know that. That's really common. That's, the culprit for a lot of things, right? Habitat loss and fragmentation. Fragmentation is that we're splitting up habitats into these small little parcels. So again, national parks are great, but if we don't have anything connecting them in between, there's no corridors there. That's still fragmentation. Another reason, invasive species. These usually don't provide as good as food sources or protection as our native species. Decline in food sources. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about bird food tonight. And cats. So if you are trying to bring birds into your yard and you let your cat out, those are kind of opposing forces. Even declawed cats are really good at knocking birds down. So again, there's a kind of statistic there. They're estimated to kill 2.6 billion birds annually. And that's a big reason for bird decline. All right, so let's get into birds. What's so special about birds? Why should we garden for birds? What do they do for us or for the environment?
Bugs.
Eat bugs? Yeah. So there's some pest control there maybe. Do they do anything else?
It doesn't really matter what they do or don't do. They live with us.
They live with
And
us.
we have taken too much of their land, and we need to encourage them to stay.
Yeah, great. So for the ecosystem, and this is for us too, what they do, seed dispersal is huge. It's a biggie. More than half of the plant species on Earth rely on animals to disperse their seeds. So if with the loss of birds and mammals spread seeds too, plants can't spread. They can't shift their ranges. They can't, plants are sessile creatures, right? They can't just get up and move. They need animals to spread their seeds. So seed dispersal is huge. And so without birds and other animals to disperse their seeds, we're not going to have as many plants around, and they're not going to be able to spread their ranges. Fruiting plants rely on birds and other animals to disperse their seeds. Colorful flowers, they lure in that wildlife to do the work for the plant. And birds are they're really efficient in removing the pulp around the seed. So not all animals can do that. So especially when we talk about tropical environments, they can get down to the seed so the seed can actually germinate. Otherwise, the seed can't grow if it still has all that pulp on it. We did mention pest control. So birds do eat a lot of insects. And if you think about birds of prey, our raptor friends, they can eat a lot of rodents. So there hasn't been a whole lot of research done on this, but we do know that in the lifetime of a barn owl, it can eat more than 11,000 mice. And those mice would have consumed 13 tons of crops. So that is a lot of pest control for our agricultural friends, and also just in our own yards too. They do have some pollination services as well. So when birds are visiting flowers, they're helping pollinate them, which we need the pollen to move from one plant to another so that the plant can make more seeds or more fruit. Birds help us humans too in more direct ways. They're entertaining. There's a lot of industry for bird, right? Bird seed, bird watching, those are all, that's industry there that creates jobs. There's lots of products there. We are connected. I think we kind of touch on this too, connecting us to nature. Birds are a great way to do that. Research has shown that when we connect to nature, our moods are boosted, our well-being is improved. Seeing and hearing, there's been research on this, seeing and hearing birds boosts our moods. And more services. Even in other parts of the world, fertilizer in the form of guano is a big deal. We can thank the vultures for sanitation. So if we didn't have vultures eating carcasses when we're out for a hike, there'd probably be, more decaying bodies laying around, so we can thank them for that. And really what we're kind of now realizing is how everything is interconnected. Living systems are interconnected, and so the decline of one species or one type of species have impacts that ripple across an entire ecosystem in ways that we are just kind of now starting to really realize. Okay, so hopefully I haven't totally scared you. All hope is not lost. Research like this shows that we have a responsibility to be stewards of the land, and we need to apply conservation at that holistic level. So not just thinking about we're going to preserve the turkeys, but thinking about conservation at this more holistic level. So bird feeders are great and enjoyable. Feeding birds is certainly not the only way to help improve backyard habitat. So we can do that through landscaping, which provides food for a wider variety of birds, as well as shelter and nesting places and perches. So let's see how we can do that. We're going to look at the elements of a bird-friendly garden. Pretty simple: food, cover, and nest sites. Okay? If you can think about those three things in your yard or in your garden, that is how we can garden for birds. So we're going to spend the most time talking about food. What does bird food look like? Does it look like a bird feeder? This is pretty common what we think of when we think of, if I just said, what does bird food look like? You might think of seeds that you buy, of bird food, right? Okay, that's true. Many birds do include seeds in their diets, especially when the seeds are plentiful. So not usually in the summer, but maybe in the late winter, spring, and fall. There's only a few groups, like the finches and doves, that can actually complete their life cycle on seeds alone. So many seeds in our area, the temperate zone, are nutritious, but they're depleted and not abundant again until the fall usually. And not all birds are feeder birds. You might notice that you might have other birds in your yard, but not all of them come to the feeder. So some of them don't really rely on those seeds. Fruits are another great source of food, right? They need fruits. But no North American bird species makes a living on fruit alone. So what does that leave us with? The bugs, right? All the insects. Insects are really rich sources of proteins and fats for birds. Spiders make up half of the prey items that wrens feed their young. This is kind of a cool picture because it actually has a spider and a earwig. I'm not a fan of earwigs. Earwig in the beak of that wren. So here's something interesting. Insects are really high in protein. They have up to twice as much protein pound for pound as does beef. Insects also have organs in their abdomens called fat bodies. Those are really high, or really rich in those high energy lipids. And adults require protein and fats just like baby birds for that muscle tone and energy. And they will take insects over seeds or fruit almost any time. So here's where I'm going to try to impress you with some statistics about these insects. 96% of birds depend entirely on insect protein to feed their young, especially caterpillars. Caterpillars are the big one. They're big, juicy caterpillars. They're so yummy for those nestlings, for those baby birds. So even the birds at your feeders, in the springtime, they are still looking for insects, caterpillars especially, to feed their young. The abundance of flying insects has been linked to fledgling success. So fledgling are those baby birds. And that's before they're able to fly. So insects are so important in bird diets, then when our cold weather decreases, about 54% of the birds that breed here in North America migrate. And you have to think migration is hugely dangerous, right? And that is a huge percentage of birds to migrate because food sources deplete here. So they're going to go somewhere where there's plenty of insects. Chickadees, pretty amazing stuff about chickadees. They need to collect between 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed their clutch of babies. So that's 350 to 570 caterpillars every day. That's a lot, right? It's a lot of caterpillars. Okay, So how can we do this? How can we help birds find all this delicious food? And this is where I do the bait and switch, that you came here to talk about gardening for birds, but I'm actually going to talk gardening for insects. Okay, so hopefully don't get mad at me there. You have to have insects in your yard if you want these songbirds. And we're talking about the backyard birds, right? The songbirds in your yard. And the best way to do that is to garden for insects. So tonight we're going to kind of focus on this idea of right plant, right place. You might have heard that before. We're going to incorporate native plants. We're going to remove invasive plants. We're going to talk about diversity of plants, which will help increase habitat. And we'll talk about pesticides as well. So let's talk a little bit more about each of these. So right plant, right place is really understanding your site and the plant that you want to plant there. And it requires research before you purchase and plant. This is what I really try to emphasize, that before you plant, understand what kind of space you have, how big the plant is going to get, maybe what type of soil you have. Really research that out. So white baneberry, I use this example because it's a great plant for wildlife, but it's toxic to humans. So if you have maybe small children or grandchildren running around and they're prone to sampling berries, you might not want this in your yard, even though it's great for wildlife. So we really need to think about the plant's requirements and what kind of site you have. Planting something in your garden or your yard that's going to take over and get too big is not going to make it successful. So we really have to think about what you're going to do. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that research? So I provided some resources. This yellow sheet is that handout that you have. Those are some great native plants for attracting birds. This birdscaping book is available from the library. When I first got it, I got it from the library, birdscaping, and it's great because it's in the Midwest, so it's locally specific. And it's great because these will provide a lot of great sources. This book also tells you how big the plant gets, what kind of soil it needs, how much light it needs. These are all considerations that you need to take in before you plant something new. Maybe you have some plants that aren't doing so well in your yard, and you can start to think, well, maybe they're not getting what they need from your spot. Maybe they need to be moved, or maybe they're just not supposed to be grown there. So these are two great resources. There's lots of other resources. I do point some in my handout. I have some links, but these are some great ones to get you started. There's some additional information. The Audubon Society has a native plants database. So you can type in your zip code and do a search, and it will come up with plants that will grow in your area. Okay, and it will give you lists of those plants and what birds those plants could attract. So that's another great resource to check out the Audubon Native Plants database. And you can plant native plants in containers too. This isn't just some big yard, 5-acre lot. You can do it in containers on your balcony. You just have to find the right plants to plant in those containers. Okay, what's the big deal about native plants? Why am I talking about native plants so much? Well, insects that eat plants are specialists. They can only feed on one or maybe a few related plant species. So native plants and insects and wild birds have co-evolved. They have their life cycles matched up. The timing of those food sources come out at just the right size, just the right kind of nutrition, and just when the birds need them. Okay, so the life cycles of insects and plants have matched up, that insects emerge at certain times when those plant resources are available. So we can't say the same for ornamental or non-native plants, we should say. I'm not saying you don't plant those annuals or some other plants, but have a variety. The native plants are going to provide more resources. They are powerhouses of food and resources. So if you've ever heard of Doug Tallamy, he has this chart, and it lists the number of butterfly or moth species supported by different plants. And you can see that oak is just a powerhouse for the number of species that it produces or supports, 534. So that might be at different stages of the life cycle. That might be at some stages when they're just caterpillars. That might be adults. So it could be at different stages of those butterfly and moths. So these native plants are just powerhouses. They provide all these resources for insects and therefore everything that depends on insects. So of course you can plant other things, but if we're really thinking about gardening for wildlife, we're going to focus on the native plants. Non-native or invasive species, especially shrubs and small trees, maybe birds are using them for cover or nesting. But if that's all there is available, that's what they're going to use. okay? But when we're thinking about food sources for birds, non-native plants don't provide as much food as our native plants do. So research has shown that native plants contain higher numbers of insects and other arthropods than the non-native plants. So again, those plant-eating insects are specialists. They can only feed on certain things, and plants have a lot of defense mechanisms. So insects have gotten around those defense mechanisms on the plants that they feed on. On a non-native plant, they might not be able to get through that. That might be poisonous to them versus a native plant. So then they can't digest that plant. So again, the native plants support a lot more. The National Wildlife Federation came out with a number that native plants may support 10 to 50 times as many species of native wildlife as non-native plants. And native wildflowers offer more nectar for hummingbirds as well than the cultivated flowers. Bird nesting and non-native vegetation are more likely to fall victim to predators because of the different structure. I read recently that in some non-native plants, the thorns were longer versus the native, which were shorter and stubbier. And the bird nestlings, the nests survived better in that shorter, stubbier cover in that shrub. So even though they were the same species, one was a cultivar, non-native, had different thorns than the native species. So, sometimes maybe our non-native ones lack thorns, or it's a different shape, it's a different structure. So again, yes, birds are going to use non-native species if that's all there is. But especially for food sources, cover and nesting sites are great, but if there's no food, the birds aren't going to survive. They're not going to be around. We'll talk a little bit about how diverse resources can feed birds all year long, and there's some examples on the slide here. So we have a picture of woodpecker holes, so there's lots of great insects that they were digging for in that probably a dead tree or a snag. That next picture is a picture of a goldenrod stem gall. So there is a little insect larva inside that gall that creates a round that's inside on a plant. Leaf litter, so leaving the leaves piled up there, that can provide a lot of good insect resources underneath there. Beetles, spiders are going to live under there. Those seed sources, that's a picture of echinacea. Those are great. So we can leave some of these things around all year long instead of cleaning up. So increasing the diversity of our plantings, we can provide food all year long, especially migrating birds. They're going to refuel on their journey. When we have these large and diverse populations of insects, we're going to create large and diverse populations of the next step, of the birds and other animals. Bird groups, they're going to depend on insects, seeds, and fruit and berries, and all of these are food sources in the wintertime. Okay, so they're still looking for insects in the wintertime. They're still looking for seeds. They're still looking for fruit. So that in that bark of the trees, like I mentioned, there could be different stages of insects living in there. So insects overwinter here in Wisconsin at different stages. So the larva might be underneath that bark or in a dead tree or underneath something. We can leave snags only if they're safe. So a snag is like a broken off tree. If it's safe in your yard, it's not going to fall on something and cause any danger. We can leave those. Lots of great insects in those dead wood structures. So we can have insects spending the winter in the seed heads of wildflower or gulls, like that picture of the goldenrod one. These seeds that are available through the winter, so with your perennial gardens, you can leave them. You don't have to cut everything down in the fall. Just leave it and cut it back in the spring. Those are great seed resources for birds all winter long. Don't deadhead or cut down those perennial plants. Leave it messy. Now, if you have vegetable gardens, definitely clean those up every year. An annual vegetable garden, we want to clean that up. But these perennial gardens, I would say leave them up unless you know you had a disease problem in there. Leave it messy. Some other resources that can feed birds all year long are if you have some space or have some area to have some fruiting things, shrubs or trees that have berries that persist through the winter. Some of these are listed in the resources that I gave you. A couple of examples, we have northern hackberry. These berries are usually available until February and eaten by nearly 50 species of birds. Red cedar, it retains those freshy pale blue berries as late as March. Cedar waxwings love them. You can plant hawthorns or winterberry. Sometimes you do need a male and a female plant for these berry-producing plants, so make sure if you are planting something that if you need a male and a female to produce berries that you get both. Again, that's doing our research before we plant something. Bird feeders I'm going to touch on because they do provide supplemental food. Okay, so I'm not saying you shouldn't do bird feeders. You can absolutely do your bird feeders. They're fun to watch the birds. There's some things I want you to remember, though, as you're doing your bird feeders here. Different types of food are going to attract different species. So the feed itself is important. We want to do high-quality food. I'm not endorsing any stores or anything, but if you go to Wild Birds Unlimited website, it will tell you what foods attract which birds. So again, just kind of looking some things up. If you want cardinals in your yard, let's buy some food that is going to attract the cardinals. We want really high-quality, nutrient-dense seed, like black sunflower oil seeds. Cracked corn's okay, peanuts, thistle. The seed should not contain any filler, so avoid the red millet or the flax. White proso millet will attract birds like dark-eyed juncos and American tree sparrows. Peanuts are great for blue jays and cardinals. Thistle or Niger is good for the winter finches, like American goldfinches and pine siskin. Sunflower is going to attract your white-breasted nuthatches and black-capped chickadees. Your feeder doesn't have to be fancy, but try to keep it dry. So if it has a little roof on it, that's great. If it's prone to getting wet, you're going to need to clean it out more. Make sure it maybe has some drain holes so moisture can drain out. We don't want that seed getting moldy or gummed up. You can have multiple feeders in different styles so that there's less competition between birds and you can attract different varieties. Do not feed bread or crackers or popcorn, any human kind of treats to birds. That is not good nutrition for them. Feeders should be within 3 feet or more than 30 feet from your window to avoid those collisions. So that's a big problem for birds, are window collisions. So if you have it closer to your window or farther away, that's better. And keep it dry and clean. You can clean your feeders. I did include those instructions in your handout. You can do a little diluted bleach, rinse it out, make sure you rinse, and dry it out before you add that food again. But just because you're providing food doesn't mean you're going to prevent them from moving on. When it's time to migrate, birds are going to migrate. You're not going to keep them in your yard just because you have a bird feeder, right? So they're going to move on just because that's what they're going to do. Bird baths and providing water. All birds need water. So even if you can't provide a bird bath, say you could put out like a dish of water, we just want it to be shallow. So we don't want it more than 2 or 3 inches deep. If you do have a bird bath, make sure it's on a sturdy pedestal. We want to have something that's a non-slip basin. Need to clean this too, even in the wintertime, if you're keeping it going. You can add moving water. Birds love it. I've seen some little solar fountains on Amazon, and birds love having that little bit of moving water in the bird bath. If you have a winter source that you want to keep going, then have a little heater in it. You can use ponds and other sources in the winter, but if it's something that's going to freeze over, then we need to have a little heater in it so they can still use it. Okay. So our next big topic is about pesticides. So this is where I'm going to spend my other majority of my time here. Talking about reducing pesticides and using responsibly. So what is a pesticide? Let's just start with a basic. It's any substance or a mixture of substances that are intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest. Okay, so we kind of lump these things into categories. But there are many, many kinds of pesticides. There are more than 600 registered ingredients and 25,000 products on the market. Now, this talk is not anti-chemical, not anti-pesticides. It's about using pesticides responsibly. Okay, and we'll go through some. So they're kind of grouped into these categories. Insecticides kill insects. Fungicides kill fungus. Herbicides kill weeds and plants. Rodenticides kill rodents. Okay? Homeowners can apply up to 10 times the amount of pesticides per acre compared to farmers. So we all have these products under our sinks, in our garage, in our sheds, in various forms, or various services, or various products. Everybody's, using them in some form, in some way. So really the question is, what do they kill? So if insecticides kill insects, that's the job of the insecticide, but it might not just kill one type of insect. Fungicides kill fungus, but it can have detrimental effects on the things that we need in the guts of animals, especially bees. There's a lot of research coming out about the bee health and fungicides now. There's other ingredients in something an herbicide might have. So you have other ingredients in there to actually get that chemical into the plant. And it's been found that some of those things, like the surfactants they're called, are more toxic than the actual active ingredient. Rodenticides, they kill rodents, but what happens if a bird eats that mouse then, or something like that? So, and then another question that we ask about pesticides is where do they go after you spray them or after you use them? They can go on to the plants, insect, animals, other sources that you didn't mean to get them on. Some can bind to soil and get tracked into your home. They can bind to air particles, or they can bind to dust particles and drift through the air. They can go on people who apply pesticides into water. And the problem is that it takes 10 to 20 years to see any effects. And in the meantime, we're producing more and more pesticides. We're always doing that. Okay, so we're going to go back in time and look at an example with the bald eagle. And now probably a lot of us remember hearing about DDT. It was such a big deal, and we probably kind of all know the story about the bald eagle. So we'll go through a little story about the bald eagle and DDT. DDT was the first of the modern synthetic insecticides. It was synthesized in 1874. It was promoted as an insecticide by 1939. So by the mid-40s, widespread use of DDT in North America. It was used on crops, homes, and gardens, and it was used to control mosquitoes because mosquitoes transmit malaria. By 1945, DDT was really widely used to control mosquitoes and agricultural pests. So there were steep declines from this use. So remember, mid-1940s, really widely used, through 1963, really steep declines in bald eagle populations. Why? What did the DDT do to the bald eagles?
I think the egg was weak, right?
What's that?
The egg was weak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it caused the females to lay extremely thin-shelled eggs that even when the incubating parents sat on them, the eggs would break. So the DDT didn't directly kill the adults. It was causing this problem with the eggs. And by the year 1963, massive nest failure, there was only 487 pairs of bald eagles in the lower 48 states. Okay, so kind of an ongoing crisis, right? We can recognize that now in hindsight, of course. In the late 60s, the Endangered Species Preservation Act came about. That was in 1966. And in 1970, though, we were looking at peregrine falcon populations. Those continued decreasing at alarming rates, and then they were listed as endangered as well. And DDT has similar effects on peregrine falcons and other raptors. They had massive nest failure. Eagles, ospreys, hawks, other bird species, massive nest failure. So finally, in 1972, we banned DDT. And that was a lot of pressure on Congress from scientific and environmental movements. The main reason was because we were seeing these really bad impacts on birds, on their nests, right? So we were worried about our own health. So that was kind of the big impetus of, well, let's do something, let's ban DDT. And the happy ending is that bald eagles recovered, and they were removed from the endangered species list. Okay, so who cares? Why did we time travel and talk about DDT and bald eagles? None of you are using DDT. Okay, so remember when I said backyard birds were declining? And homeowners use 10 times more pesticides than farmers ever could. So that's why we're kind of talking about that example. Pesticide use is very common in home and garden settings. So now we have all these different kinds. We have organophosphates. Those were developed in the 90s. They're known to be very toxic to bees, aquatic insects, fish, and bird species. Pyrethroids, highly toxic to aquatic life and bees. Neonicotinoids, huge increase of use, very toxic to bees, insects, and aquatic insects. So what do you do? Okay. What effect does a pesticide have on non-target organism? That's the thing. So we don't really know. These neonicotinoids, well, we know they impact bees, but what about songbirds? And it's hard to say in terms of direct toxicity. We didn't really see that with the bald eagle and DDT. Really, it wasn't just like, oh, bald eagles are falling out of the sky. They were having problems with their eggshells. So there was some articles in Science that said that direct toxicity of pesticides to birds and mammals is decreased. Toxicity to those invertebrates, our insects, aquatic insects, pollinators, has increased. It's doubled from between 2005 to 2015. So I think I've made a point that if we kill insects, birds don't have anything to eat. Mosquito treatments, those use pyrethroids. They kill mosquitoes, but they also kill fireflies and butterflies and pollinators and everything else. Research has shown, they did some research with monarch caterpillars feeding on milkweed that was treated with pyrethroids, so mosquito killers, and they were killed 3 weeks later. mayfly population. So if you've ever seen those big mayfly emergencies, I used to live in La Crosse, and we would have to get the snow plows out to get mayflies off the road. That's a huge food source for birds, right? I mean, that is timed when there's lots of baby birds out too. So if we're seeing declines in those aquatic insects, we're going to see declines in our birds as well. And the pesticide label is not required to state what impact it has on insects, other non-target insects or pollinators. So what do you do? Again, you need to do your research. I'm going to show you an example from the National Pesticide Information Center. This is linked in your handout. There is a website there. I picked this Ortho Home Defense, not to pick on it, not to, say good, bad, whatever, just to show it as an example. So it's a backyard mosquito and bug killer, pretty common. We can zoom into those active ingredients that I put up there, the bifenthrin and the zeta-cypermethrin. Okay, so what we can do is we can look up these active ingredients on this National Pesticide Information Center. And what we do when we look that up on this website is that we're going to find information that it is toxic to bees, fish, and small aquatic organisms. So it might say low toxicity to birds, but birds eat the insects. So again, we are worried about our food sources here. So what are our top 5 ways to reduce pesticide use? First of all, just identify the pests, and I can help you with that. My contact information is your handout. You can say, hey, Julie, I have this bug that's eating my plants. What do I do about it? I will help you through that. We first need to identify it. Maybe it's not even a problem. Maybe we don't need to do anything about it. So first we need to identify what it is and learn about it. And then maybe we need to adjust our tolerance of pests depending on what it is. Our plants can usually take pretty a lot of damage. I know Japanese beetles, they haven't been bad the past couple of years, but plants can tolerate quite a bit of damage. So, sometimes we have to adjust our tolerance. And let's do our research before you buy and use any pesticide. So I know that's hard because we go to the store and be like, oh, I have to take care of this problem. But we can use that website to look things up, or before you even go and buy, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe there's some different things that we can do without using pesticides. If you do have a lawn, practice good lawn care practices to reduce those chemicals. So we want responsible herbicide management on your lawn. A lot of times that just has to do with timing. If you're putting down crabgrass preventer in the fall, it's not going to do anything. That has to be done in the spring. So a lot of time is the timing of when you use things. So when I say use responsibly, we want to use things at the right time, in the right amount, with the appropriate gear and all of that. So there might be a time and place to use chemicals. We just have to do a little bit of research before we use them. And share your knowledge and help others. If you have a neighbor that you need to, maybe have some discussion with, or some friends, do it in a positive way. We don't need to be coming down on people, right? I know some of those conversations can be hard, but let's just kind of have those conversations. We can make more informed decisions, because a lot of times we don't know what we don't know. So we're going to keep moving here. We have our 3 big elements of our bird-friendly garden. We talked a lot about food. I don't want to forget the cover and the nest sites either. So birds need cover or shelter to help them to survive really bad weather conditions, right? And escape from predators. They need to hide from those predators. So these are just some examples of cover. If you're leaving things messy or natural in those areas of your yard, you can. Maybe it's not your whole yard, especially if you live in town or something, but maybe there's a section of your yard that you can do. If you have a big yard, maybe you don't have to mow all of it. Maybe you can leave a section that's a little bit more messy or a little bit more natural. So if we kind of look at what's happening in nature, let's mimic nature. In the coldest temperatures, birds are going to conserve energy, so they're going to try to hunker down and find that sheltered spot. Evergreens provide great shelter. Those conifer trees, they can help block winds. You can put your feeders next to them. Dead stalks of grasses and wildflowers can provide cover. We kind of mentioned waiting until spring to cut those down, or if you have a prairie, waiting until spring to burn it. Maybe you have a rain garden or some sort of perennial bed. Leave these up. Leave them up until the spring. You want to wait until the temperatures reach 50 degrees for a few nights in the springtime, because after that, then the insects will have emerged. So a lot of times if you're leaving those perennial things up, wait to cut them back until the nighttime temperatures are over 50 degrees in the spring, because that's when those insects that are living in the soil and that leaf litter underneath those plants, then they'll come out. You can make a brush pile. Sometimes people do this every year. They construct a brush pile every year and then take it down. Or maybe there's an area of your yard that you can, have that. Animals are going to use those for nesting, for resting, for hiding spots. You can kind of start with that base layer of large logs. That's kind of what this picture is showing, this constructed, this man-made brush pile here. Really particularly important in the winter when trees and shrubs have lost their foliage. So this provides some good cover. You can throw your Christmas tree out in the yard. That is some shelter too. Tree cavities. We kind of talked a little bit about dead trees and snags for the insect source, but those are good sources for protection too. So maybe there's a cavity in that dead tree or that snag and they can hide out in there. Talking a little bit about nest sites. So pretty much this is the same list for nest sites. We want to have, very natural sources that they can use. And interestingly, holes that have been excavated by woodpeckers help other cavity nesting species. So if you don't have natural cavities or that space on your yard, you can certainly put up supplemental nest sites. So these bird houses like these are for cavity nesters. It's not for all types of birds. So again, depending on the type of birds you want to come to your yard, you can build them a nest box or buy and put up a nest box. The number and kinds of nest boxes you put up in your yard depend a great deal on the kinds of birds in your neighborhood and the size of bird territory. So some birds are pretty territorial. You might only have one species in your yard, but some will tolerate other bird species. So in this book, I'm going to point to this book again. There is a whole section on nest boxes, the size that they need to be built for different bird species and things like that. So if that's something you're interested in, I would point you to this book or looking some of that stuff up. So what else can you do? If you want to get more involved with some kind of citizen science opportunities, there's Project Feeder Watch. This is through Cornell. That's a winter-long survey of birds that visit feeders through November through April. And you don't need a feeder. So if you have an area that has some plantings or habitat and water that attracts the birds, you can count birds for as long as you like. It's a really flexible schedule. So you can participate in that. There's something called the Great Backyard Bird Count and the Audubon Christmas Bird Count. There's probably some local organizations that maybe you would want to get involved with. The local chapter of the Audubon Society. Wild Ones really focuses on native plants. There's lots of local organizations that are going to be focused on conservation. So you can think about some of those things. So this is just a review here to be a bird-friendly gardener. Remembering what you do matters. There's that ripple effect. So if you garden for pollinators, there's always a lot of talk about gardening for pollinators, you're automatically helping birds because you're helping insects. You're automatically helping other wildlife. You don't have to choose, I'm going to garden for pollinators or I'm going to garden for bees. They're all going to come into your garden. And we talked a lot about, we gave you a lot of information about how to garden for birds or insects, how to make your yard, more friendly, maybe trying to think about reducing pesticides or maybe eliminating them or just using them more responsibly. So I'm going to give you a few seconds here just to kind of reflect and digest. I will stay for questions. If there's things that you're still curious about, things you have questions about, I am happy to try to answer those. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to say, I volunteer with wildlife rehab. There's nothing more painful than having a bird of prey come in that has eaten a poisoned mouse. Mm-hmm. And what happens to it. So I'm just going to repeat that for the recording. And I've seen that some organizations too that they I'm trying to think of the one that I follow too. So birds of prey that come in have eaten a poisoned mouse. So if you're putting out poison, you just have to think again, where does this go after I put it? I'm not here to judge. I'm not advocating one way or the other, but we just have to be more responsible about thinking about, well, if a bird is going to eat this mouse or rat or whatever, what's going to happen? And it can be a real serious issue. And what else can we do? Then what's the alternative? Okay, we have a mice problem. What else can we do? Thanks for that. Any questions or other comments? Yes?
I feed the birds, but I seem to be feeding more deer than birds.
Yeah. That's a hard one. But so you're bringing wildlife in, right? I don't have any good suggestions for how to keep the deer away.
How about them down at night?
Or turkeys, yeah. Squirrels, yeah. I know, squirrels are pretty inventive how they can get to the feeder. Even the squirrel-proof feeders, right? They can still get those. So, you know, to me, it's all wildlife, and if we're trying to bring wildlife in, then it's a positive. You know, I don't think we have to choose between what we bring in. But yes, I understand that deer, you know, if they're knocking down your feeders or just there. But, you know, deer are really accustomed. They're going to live in more and more urban environments. I used to live out in Ashland, Oregon. We would have deer walking through downtown. I mean, like downtown, the town proper. I mean, that's just how accustomed they were to people. So as we move into their habitats, they are going to have to get used to us, right? So they become more accustomed. So I don't have any good good things to try
Well,
to
they
keep
go
deer
from
away.
a bird feeder in the winter to my garden in
Yeah.
the summer.
Yeah.
Chomp off the blossoms.
Yeah, and there's different things, you know, you can plant that are supposed to, that deer avoid. I know that it's not foolproof though.
Are ants a good source for birds to eat? I have a lot of ants in the yard. I don't want to kill them, but I'm just wondering.
I'm sure they would eat them, yeah. And usually ants don't cause a problem for us as people, so. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of ants out there, but yeah, I would leave them if you can leave them. Definitely, yes.
You'd mentioned Japanese beetles. I have those on my raspberries,
Yeah.
on my cherry tree.
Yeah.
They just eat the leaves, and I know that they're dropping, you know, their larvae in the spring.
Yeah.
Is it okay to leave them on there? Is it harming my plants?
To leave the Japanese beetles? I mean, they are voracious eaters.
Yes, they decimate my leaves.
Yeah.
But the fruit seems to be fine.
If the fruit seems to be fine, I think what I've seen is that plants can usually tolerate about 40% damage, which is quite a bit. You know, I've seen that research for grapevines particularly to experience that type of damage. I mean, if you were seeing problems with fruit production, then I would try to control them, and we can, you know, you can go out there or have a kid go out there or have whoever go out there and knock them off into the soapy bucket and do that, you know. There's different watering practices during the summer, so if you're irrigating your lawn in the summer, we want to avoid certain times of that because drier habitat is better to prevent the grubs from hatching out. So the grubs are going to live in the soil, especially in a turf and lawn. So there's different practices that we can do to kind of control all life cycles, but Japanese beetles eat over 400 species of plants, so they're a tricky one. They're a hard one to, you know, we have to. I would avoid the traps, the Japanese beetle traps. My husband loves them because I think it gives him personal satisfaction of like collecting them into a trap and killing them. If you've had those traps around, they get real stinky. And they actually attract more to the area, so then you actually get more damage to your plants because they've attracted more beetles. But yeah. If you have yard or garden questions during the year, my contact information is there. Call my office, email me, reach out. I'm happy to answer any yard, garden, tree, plant question or point you to someone who can answer it if I can't. I'm happy to do that. I know they'll come up when you're seeing spots on your tomatoes or a new bug in the yard and you're wondering what it is and what to do about it. Yeah. Happy to answer those. We have lots of resources through Extension too. Well, I'll stick around in case you want to come up and ask a question or talk about anything. I appreciate you filling out that survey. You can just drop them up here on the table back there. Make sure to have those handouts on your way out too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.